Welcome to the Pivot Point podcast. This season, I'm focused on sharing stories and ideas from expert on diversity and inclusion. This week, I am joined by Laraine McKinnon. We're going to talk to her about her background and expertise in diversity and inclusion. Together, we'll leave you with some actionable tips to think about and discuss with your organization. We share this information because inclusive leadership is a journey. It requires bravery and courage, and you do not have to do it alone. At Next Pivot Point, I believe we are stronger together. We are one. So we're going to dig into this week's expert, and we have a real treat for you. Laraine runs LMC17, a diversity and inclusion consulting firm that uses behavioral science and big data to help companies unlock productivity, innovation, and profitability. She's also an advisor and strategist for MTrain, a culture tech platform working to reduce workplace harassment and unconscious bias to create healthy workplace cultures. She also runs a women's leadership nonprofit and its talent incubation in Silicon Valley. Ooh, exciting. Working with women from companies like Apple, Tesla, Facebook, PayPal, and Salesforce, and many more. Oh, I'm so excited to have you, Laraine. Welcome.
Thank you. I'm delighted to be here. Thank you very much for the invitation.
Absolutely. We're going to cover a lot of ground today. But as always, we like to start out with your background. How did you get into something like D&I?
Well, I really started off in my college degree, which is in women's studies, and I went to an all-women's college, Wellesley College. So it was an interest of mine from the very beginning. I was interested in multidisciplinary topics. I have another degree as well in political science, and just the culmination of understanding, um, you know, women's history, the feminist movement, what I was seeing in the media and advertising around images of women, and sort of these concepts that women were seen as a second class. And I thought, well, that just isn't right at all. So got a women's studies and political science degree. Moved into a totally different career. So I pivoted right out of college into financial services, where I gained some interesting background. So I had a fantastic global experience, got to work with customers and colleagues all around the world. I watched women grow their careers in a predominantly male culture. I got introduced to behavioral science, particularly around behavioral finance, and then discovered the entire field of behavioral science. And through my career in financial services, I came back into the US business, learning about employee benefits and financial wellness, which gave me access and information to HR and how human resources was changing and the importance of that, and also gave me a lot of information and tools and knowledge around big data and predictive analytics. So following my financial services career, I said, hey, we are not where we should be here in, I think it was 2017 when I left financial services. There are bigger problems to solve in diversity and inclusion space. And I was just had kind of collected a portfolio of tools that I thought would make me particularly impactful in the space. It was sort of always a first love. It was put in the sidelines while I grew my own career, and then sort of realized, hey, my own career is being impacted by some of the bias that I learned about. Let me see how that's affecting other people. Let me see how other organizations are managing through that. And it led into a whole practice of diversity and inclusion consulting.
Oh, well, you're a woman after my heart. I can attest to so much of myself I saw in your story. I studied women's studies too in college, and I minored in it. So in hindsight, I'm a business major, and I happen to really like these women's studies classes, so I took them on the side. And I remember people like, why did you study that? Like, what did you want to do with that? And I didn't figure it out. It took me 12 years to figure it out. And I also spent time in financial services. So I know, just like all industries, super white male dominated. So we can do better, and wanting it to be a part of the solution versus the problem, and applying the tools from your background now in your business. I mean, that's just really cool how those things come full circle. So, oh gosh. So Laraine, thinking about the tools you use with your clients and working with some of the, Silicon Valley shining stars, I'm curious, like, what do you see as far as what's working today, where we are with D&I in 2020. What have you seen as far as things, tools, success stories with your clients, or just things you've observed in the industries you support?
Yeah, I think it might depend on company size. I think the largest companies have embraced diversity and inclusion. You see, many of them will have a head of diversity and inclusion. They might have additional staff, you know, really making sure that they have enough resources towards a diversity and inclusion effort. I see great work being done in you know, making sure that there is outreach in recruiting to more diverse populations. A lot of the large companies in San Francisco, for example, have pretty diverse intern classes coming in and through their organization each year. I see some oversight on things like promotion processes, so paying attention to the data in the McKinsey Lean In Women in the Workplace research that shows that, you know, women often come into certain industries anyway, 50% women, 50% men, and yet over time going through the pipeline, more and more women and people of color fall out of that pipeline until we see, you know, predominantly white male executive teams as we do in some industries, in many industries. And so, you know, I'm seeing some good oversight around that promotion process to make sure that everybody's being given an equal chance at not just sort of getting the end promotion, but the visibility on the way, which is critically important. We know there's a lot of research around mentorship and sponsorship, and that can start earlier and earlier in women's careers. So those are some of the things I think that
Mhm.
larger companies are doing right. I see mid-sized companies, they may not have the resources yet, but they've got more awareness. Many of them are, you know, earlier in their life cycle, so they might be, you know, 5, 10 years old, growing fast, especially out here in Silicon Valley. Tons of companies growing really fast, and they may not have, you know, 3 or 4 people working in diversity and inclusion at their size, but they're much more aware of it, and a lot of that's because they are, you know, looking to get the best talent in a very competitive talent market. And so they have to have a culture that's welcoming, and they're concerned about turnover. And in a culture that is not welcoming, they're going to get high turnover of some of those really special candidates. So
Mhm.
yeah, it differs a little bit by mid-size or large size, but I imagine you're seeing something similar.
Yeah, I think size does matter. I mean, what you addressed with the larger entities is kind of that employee experience, which I know you look at D&I much like I do as the entire employee experience, right? It's not just about recruiting, it's not just about hiring, it's not just about promotions, it's the holistic experience. And I love that picture you painted of, we got to start out equal. It's this leaky faucet. We just lose all these people of color and women. Why is that? you know? Um, and there are tools, as you know in practice, with big data and using technology to help make sure that employee experience is more and more equal. What we know to be true is, people of color and those that are not white males, the majority group, tend to be treated just a little bit differently, whether there's overt behavior or most often unconscious bias, which I know you're passionate about. So, question for you, Lorraine. How do you use big data to help solve these big, hairy D&I problems inside
Yeah.
organizations?
Yeah. I mean, I think that the data tells a really important story, and oftentimes I think it tells a story that uh, folks in senior management might not be as aware of or clear about. So there's research out there, and I hope I get this right, that oftentimes people who are in the in group or who are in the majority have really different perceptions about diversity, like a diverse population, than those who are in the out group. And I think there's some statistic, and this is the part I might not get quite right, that you know, in a predominantly male workplace, the men perceive 50-50 or near 50-50 population split
Mhm.
between men and women. And the women will have a much more accurate perspective that it's really only 20% of this population that is. And so because the female has been in many cases in corporate America, the other, the presence of a female is noted, right? And so you have these populations, you get to senior managers who think that they're much more equal, who don't even realize that there's a problem in equality until they see the data. So that's kind of a long way of saying, data is often truth, with the
Mhm.
little asterisk that data and having good, clean data is difficult, right? Companies are working on collecting these data sets, and there's a lot of moving parts. But to the extent that you can get good data about your population, about the growth of your population, understand
Mhm.
your turnover rates, understand your promotion rates.
That's the best piece of data, isn't
You
it?
bet.
Like,
You
do
bet.
you find that promotion data, I mean, that's essentially saying, "Who fits in here? Whose behavior are we gonna reward?"
You bet. Absolutely. But I think some of the things that I'm interested in tracking that a lot of companies don't is demotions. It is a pretty common way to put a woman off of a leadership or a promotion track, to, she may be managing a team of 10 or 20, and to move her out of that role and to put someone else in that role. And it's often a male who gets put into that role. And the woman is converted over into an individual contributor type role, that she may be able to make a real go of and stand out and use it as a career boost. But more often companies really look to who their managers are. Their managers have a lot of control around compensation, so they've got a lot of power because they're determining compensation of the team. They get to allocate opportunities, and so managers are often seen as higher sort of priority than individual contributors. And so there's this kind of demotion process that frequently happens at mid-levels for women across all industries.
Mhm.
And not enough companies are tracking demotions. There's less oversight when you move somebody out of a team manager role. Sometimes it's not announced very broadly because you don't want to embarrass the person that you're moving out of that role, and yet now it's part of the hidden underlying data. So
Mhm.
there are some aspects, I think, that companies who are truly interested in becoming more diverse and more inclusive, there's some aspects of their data that would highlight some of what happens. And a lot of senior managers just they they don't really understand what's happening. They just don't have the perspective, and that's one element that could be really insightful.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, it speaks to your own bias and the lens of you looking at the world. I think the research you're talking about either comes from McKinsey or Lena, and heck, they publish all this research, right? But it's a lot of men will say if there's one woman on the leadership team, that's enough. Like
Yeah.
suddenly it's equal, whereas women are like, "Are you kidding me? We
Yep.
could do a lot better than this." So it's just that perspective, unless you're in that position to know what it feels like to be the other, as you and I experienced in corporate America, it's always the other, always the one woman at the leadership team table or the table. You don't know what that's like. It seems good enough. And then on the flip side, once you make it known that's a problem with data, then you have to do something about it. Now it's not just one person's perspective, it's a holistic perspective. And I love your thought on not just promotions, not just hiring, the easy to capture stuff, but the demotions, the other stories. Performance management, how we manage performance across genders is so telling. I mean, there's so many interesting wrinkles. So I'm sure you get this pushback a lot, Lorraine. So I'm going to ask you this question. And my clients will tell me, like, "Oh, I can't track all that data. I don't have all that information." And I'm like, "You don't have an HRIS system?" How do you work with clients when that happens?
Yeah, I mean, that was the asterisk, right? Like, I do work in a lot of HRIS systems, and the data is, sometimes it's caught in this channel for this type of information and that channel for that type of information. But I think understanding that good quality data where you're tracking, year on year information, where you've got, information about groups and subgroups so that you can slice and dice the data in a couple of different ways, and then starting to collect data. Demotions is one that may or may not be a field in a data set, but I definitely strongly recommend that people collect data there. It may be a little bit subjective, but I think sometimes that's okay. If the company says, hey, this individual contributor role is equivalent to this manager role, that's all right, but how many people are you taking out of a manager role and putting them into that individual contributor role? And what does it really mean at your company? Um, so I think that the data sets can be challenging, but I think that they are so incredibly important and insightful. And let's face it, I mean, we are in the the world of data. It will drive us going forward. There's AI being written, artificial intelligence algorithms being
Mhm.
written around this data. Often the AI is being based on training sets that have bias baked into the underlying data in the training set. So, we have to be able to collect, cleanse, and use the data in HR just as much as any other technology that we have going
Yeah.
forward. HR is really a tech field now.
Yeah. Yeah, and for so long it wasn't. It was like the soft,
Right.
feely, like, nice to have,
Yep.
and to your point, I mean, the talent, the war for really good talent, I don't even like the word war, but, like, just people, it's very competitive, right? And so you're not gonna attract the best talent unless you have some good HR people processes in place, and so getting awoke, with some of this data helps people make decisions. So how do you use the data to make decisions?
Mhm. Well, it's often trying to find underlying patterns. And I often get called in. So the consulting that I do is usually with companies that are trying to drive diversity. They have implemented a lot of the best practices around recruiting, around promotion, etc. And what they find is that their numbers aren't moving towards their goals in the way that they need them to. So here in Silicon Valley, many companies will publish their diversity numbers, meaning
Hmm.
they will actually share their percentage of women, people of color, etc., on an annual basis. And you're just seeing that the numbers not only aren't tracking to the goals, to sort of that greater increase in diversity, but some of them are slipping backwards. And so I'll often work with those companies to say, hey, let's go look. You've put a lot of time and money into creating these best practice processes, into bringing in external experts in a variety of different fields to get your diversity numbers up, and it's not working. So let's go figure out why.
Right.
And the data is really important and insightful there, but also that sort of underlying subculture of how things really work, and where the processes might fall or fail because of individual motivators as opposed to these top-down processes. And so
Mhm.
that's kind of what gets me interested and excited, and that's how I think that HR will end up evolving, with a mix of data and understanding what those maybe unspoken motivators are within an organization.
Yeah, I like that. I like digging in deeper, right, to those deeper pain points. And especially if you have goals, then you're holding yourself accountable to publishing them annually and traction's not happening, man. Something's really going on, right? And it begs
Well,
that
it's hard.
question.
It's hard. Yeah, I mean, I don't know how many of the goals are reasonable
Right.
goals. Sometimes you look at these goals and you say, hey, if I were to go back and calculate this, like the next 50 roles that you hire must be women, and you can't lose any in order for you to get to this percentage that you're expecting by 2022. And that's not reasonable, right? There's just no organization that's going to say, okay, we're only hiring women for the next 50 slots. But the other piece of it is, how do you make this environment so good for your people that A, they want to stay because turnover is expensive, but B, if for their career progression they need to leave, that they
Yeah.
refer back like five great people who happen to be, diverse,
Mhm.
who think about things different ways or have a different background or different race or ethnicity or gender, whatever that might be. It's almost equally good for you to grow your talent and let them fly, and appreciate you so much that they refer other people back to you.
Yeah. Yeah. And that's the most telling data, right? The positive referrals you have. Because even if someone leaves, it might be with a really good reason, right? Doesn't mean that your organization's not being inclusive. But the trick is, do they refer other people to come in? Yeah, and you speak to another point of best practices, and most people with diverse backgrounds know other people with diverse backgrounds. So if you're looking to really diversify quickly, that's a great best practice is to be very intentional about who you ask for referrals. And to your point about these bold goals with diversity, I think it's kind of putting a blanket on the topic of like, okay, board, we're good. We're going to be diverse in 2 years, and then like great message, great intention. But as you said too, it's just unrealistic and unhelpful. What I find on the other side of that is it leads to this zero sum game mentality of, oh, great, I'm the white guy. I'm in trouble now. I have something to lose, which is the worst mistake we can make in this conversation is to isolate the key decision makers inside most organizations and the people with power. So the backlash effect, and probably why you see the numbers retreating, is because it leads to some toxic workplace behaviors when that mentality is alive and well.
Absolutely.
Um,
So many unintended consequences that come from sometimes best intentions.
mhm.
So even these referral bonuses that, you'll give your current employees for helping to find, other folks to fill slots, in technology, if you've got to build, you got to fill those engineering seats as fast as possible. And it's quick and easy for your engineers just to tap their friends, like, hey, they're, friends from college or, that they grew up with who often tend to be like them. And that really built these very homogenous populations very quickly at a lot of firms. The unintended consequence of that, if you've got this total group think, you've got these people who are all trained the
Mhm.
same way, working on a problem, who have such major blind spots that they don't realize that they're kind of infiltrating that blind spot into their product or service. So there's lots of unintended consequences that I think become clear in years. I was talking to somebody who was uh, very interested in diversity, thinking about this referral network, and was like, well, I just don't know a lot of diverse people. And I said, well, if you're going to get a referral bonus for referring people, why don't you just go meet people? Like, why don't you start either reaching out to people on LinkedIn, or when you go to conferences, just find somebody who's not like you and start to talk to them. It is not so hard to build a diverse network, particularly in a LinkedIn world.
It's so funny that you say that. I took an inventory of my network a few years ago, and I always, candidly share my diversity journey with our audience because it is a journey. I do not have this stuff figured out. And I was pretty grim when I looked at my network a few years ago. It was very white, very female, very motherly business owner. And I'm like, looks like me, thinks like me, feels safe just like me. And honestly, what I've learned in extending my network, I still have so much work to do. But what I've learned is I learn and grow so much more when I'm around people that are different than me.
Mhm.
I'm a better human because of it. And so I think when you think like, I don't know people like that, or I couldn't possibly figure it out, like you said, we're more connected now than ever, also more isolated now than ever, which is weird.
Yes, in some ways.
But it's easy to reach out to people. Like we met in a LinkedIn super pod on diversity and inclusion.
That's great.
Example of I didn't know you. I'm in the Midwest. We know people that we both trust that connected us, and and now I get to talk to somebody that's working out in Silicon Valley, which is super super interesting. Which kind of brings me to my last kind of big question for you, Lorraine, and we'll get to the big idea I always like to share.
Mhm.
Um, I'm thinking about it, on a West Coast perspective. I get this question a lot because I'm being in the Midwest and, we're known for being conservative. I live in a major city. We're not that conservative. But anyway, being where you are in the country and knowing what you know from your corporate experience and meeting people around the country and I'm assuming around the world, do you notice regional or geographic differences with this conversation on diversity and inclusion? Did you see differences from where people?
Yeah. Yeah, I do. I do. From Silicon Valley, which is just incredibly diverse. You go out to your grocery store and you're going to see a ton of different people from different backgrounds. Although we are not doing particularly well here on our socioeconomic equality, in that people are being driven out of the Bay Area because of the very high cost of living here. So, in that sense, we may not be diverse. It does trend towards higher income levels, but I think that there's just an assumption where I am that you're going to have all these different people of all these different
Mhm.
backgrounds. Your kids are going to go to school with a really diverse mix of other kids. You are, walking into any of these big companies, you're just going to see a lot of different people on campus. And that does feel different to me as I go around to different areas, particularly more remote areas.
Yeah.
So you've got Peoria in your background, I think. So, there's
Yeah.
an example.
Not a lot of diversity.
There's some diversity, but not a lot of diversity. And so you think,
Oh.
okay, if you're the only, which is the Lean In and McKinsey data that shows when you are the only one in the room, that it is particularly difficult. And so, being more aware of people who are the only and who may continue to be the only one in the room for a longer period of time.
Mhm.
Talking about diversity where, the real goal is to get people to be aware and then respectful and
Right.
then curious and then drive empathy. But when we get to the curious, we really can't ask the only Black person in the room to educate the rest of the room on what it's like to be Black. It's just not fair. It's an added.
Right.
So, I see that more distinctly in other locations that are not as diverse.
Mhm.
But we're all different. We're all human. We're all different. We all have unconscious bias. We all have the capacity for a growth mindset. And
Mhm.
so, I don't like to dwell on the stuff that's so hard when there's so much positive and so many different ways that we can
Yeah.
just appreciate one another.
I'm with you there. I mean, I think you can make any conversation pretty grim in today's world. And D&I can be, the fact that we're not achieving the results we want to achieve for one. But on the other side of it, I think thinking about what we can do, right? What are the positive tools for change? Whether that in your case, looking at that employee experience, digging into some data, helping make data drive decisions around people that have historically not, those decisions haven't been handled that way. And I think that builds respect and um, maybe more appreciation, I think more for the service areas of organizations that were undervalued before. They're cost centers. That kind of perception is very normal. And I agree with you. I think there are geographic differences with this stuff, just like you mentioned with bigger companies are more sophisticated on this and small to medium sized companies are catching up. I think same thing, big cities versus more rural areas. So it's funny. I go to Silicon Valley a few times a year, New York City a few times a year, and people always, when I come back here, they're like, so what was it like out there? Like, it's in my opinion, I think you're right. You go to the grocery store, there's less people that look like me than here at my neighborhood grocery store in the suburban Midwest.
Yeah,
But the things people ask me are identical. The
sure.
questions, the thought, like your point, we're all humans, and this issue happens everywhere. I love your point about we can't ask the Black person to represent the whole Black experience. That's exhausting and unfair, and puts a lot of burden on them to have to educate the majority group again. Um, but I also find, the more removed you are from this conversation, I think this happens sometimes in more rural areas. Um, the more interesting questions I get on stage, like I'll just give you a couple ones. So I got asked in a rural Indiana location about male supremacy, and in fact cited the Bible as reinforcing that.
Mhm.
That I encouraged him to gather a female perspective on that topic. I did not defend or explain.
Sure.
Um, but I also recently, a friend of a friend said, you do a lot of stuff with white people on, talking about diversity and inclusion. Like, when do you go talk to the Black people about diversity and inclusion? The Black-led organizations.
Yeah.
And I looked at him, and you could tell, like, a good-intentioned white guy that I just don't think he knew he was from a rural area, just didn't know what he didn't know. And I looked at him, I'm like, those organizations don't exist, right? There's very few of those types of organizations you're describing.
Mm,
And he goes, "What?"
yeah.
So it's just like men not seeing it as one woman's enough. It's the same, I think, with race, with all these diversity dimensions. You just don't see what you don't see, right? And people, the less you are exposed to diversity, the harder it is, I think, a hill to climb. But, you and I are a big fan of meeting people where they're at, right? Giving people tools in their toolboxes. So when you have this candid conversation, and it is a candid conversation, it's not easy. We would have done it already. But what would you offer to our listeners? Like, okay, one nugget, one thing to walk away with that I can do. And it's not as simple as one thing, but hopefully there's a toolbox filled with these one things that we're accumulating in this journey. What would be the perspective you'd offer, Laraine?
Yeah. I mean, I go kind of big sky on this one. Thinking about the future of work and thinking about what we want our workplace, what the utopian, the ideal workplace looks like. And, you know, what are we trying to accomplish as a corporation or other organization? Um, when do we need to accomplish it by? Let's say that we're mission driven and we're trying to come up with a scientific improvement that will help cure cancer, or we're trying to build an electric car, or whatever that might be. What would be the ideal type of talent in the room be? How would that ideal talent work together, given the fact that it could be people from all different countries who speak all different languages? Like, how would we bring people together? How would we debate? How would we brainstorm? And what would be the outcome?
Mm,
Uh, if we sort of think in that lens, it really changes the way we think about who the right talent is. Maybe it's not
mhm,
the culture fit so much as the person who brings the most unique perspective, most unique additive perspective. It totally changes the way we think about internal groups within organizations, like our employee resource groups. And it totally means that we probably need to do much more um, community building and sharing of experiences
mm,
within our groups. And I actually think that's probably the secret to all of this is making sure that people get to know each other, having just enough storytelling that people say, oh, you come from a different background, but that's really valuable to me. There's something about what you know and the way you think about the world that's valuable to me, so that I can grow as a person, and valuable to our team, so we get to more ideas, better ideas. And
mm,
we all know the research on more diverse teams create better productivity, better innovation.
mm,
um, but it's not because it's easier. It's precisely that aspect of it being harder, to have to sort of have those debates and those discussions that aren't going down a really simple path, because the path that you end up finding together is a much better path. And you've thought more about the risks, you've thought more about the opportunities, you've thought more about your total addressable market, by being more inclusive. And that's kind of like, let's just all think for a few minutes of what good and should be like, and what would feel great to us to participate in.
yeah, that visualization technique's really powerful because once you visualize it, your brain's kinda like, "Okay, let's make this happen," and on the other side of it, I love that. It's not an easy path, but it's a path that no one else is finding because they're not doing the due diligence with diversity because it is hard. And so you can really get in uncharted waters if you're doing this right. You're gonna of course, you're gonna outperform your competitors and have better ideas and make better business decisions. It's all gonna come with it. It's just not gonna be easy. And I think that's why we don't do it. Like, I think that's why
For
we
sure.
like things that are easy, instant gratification. So,
Yep. Humans, yeah.
that
We're always gonna,
visualization
yep.
and like you said, then we'd be welcoming the ERG perspective because we wanna, like, look like we wanna resemble our customer base, right? And if we're not including all those perspectives, we're probably not meeting our customer needs the best way possible. Lorraine, this has been a gift to spend some time with you today. Tell our listeners, how can they stay in touch with you? Where can they find you?
Yeah, I am on LinkedIn. I have a relatively unique name. So if you type in Laraine, last name is McKinnon, McKinnon, you will very likely find me right at the top.
It's Lorraine with an A at the beginning.
Yes.
So be sure
Yep.
to note that. And I agree. You pop right up as soon as I put you my LinkedIn. So
Perfect.
I'm thankful to find you there. And we post regularly. So be sure to follow Lorraine's work, connect with her there, send her messages with your questions. And certainly if big data in diversity and inclusion is a central focus for your organization, I think she has some tools that could help. So thanks, Lorraine, for being on the show. It was such a pleasure to talk to you today.
Thank you so much. Thanks for showcasing lots of different ideas. I think your library of podcasts are excellent. So as people tune in, to catch you on a regular basis and go back and listen to some of your earlier podcasts, the one that you've done yourselves and the one with other experts. It's
Oh,
really a
thank
great service. So thank you so much for inviting me and for taking the time to be a podcaster.
you. I love it. I love it. Awesome. Well, thank you. Did you know that you can find all 5 seasons of our 50 plus episodes at nextpivotpoint.com? And you can sign up for a complimentary 7-day preview of our new program, Lead Like an Ally, and order my new book, Lead Like an Ally. I appreciate you listening to this episode. Who do you know that needs to hear this message? Hit the share button, connect with me on LinkedIn. Julie Kratz, Kratz. I host this podcast because I believe we are stronger together. We are one.